Teacher, if a person finds their way to the source, can they return and rectify the single wrong step that poisoned their entire life? They can, the other replied, not looking up from his craft. But a river turned backward does not flow in its old bed. It floods everything around, transforming the world into a silent swamp, and in its motionless waters, he will forever see only one thing, his own face at the very moment he made the mistake. No one would have called Oleg Krasin unhappy. His life was meticulously constructed with the precision of a restorer, which he was. A quiet workshop in the basement, the scent of old paper and paste, the steady glow of a lamp over his desk. Each day was a series of measured movements, a ritual of resurrecting others' stories, sealed within the dead leather of bindings. He would take a crumbling foliant, decayed by time, and with his will, with his craft, restore its form, but not its life. His own story had long since solidified, revolving around a single point, a splinter embedded so deeply in his memory that it had become the core of his soul. 20 years ago, in a dimly lit corridor, he remained silent when he should have. Screamed. A moment of weakness, like a feint of will, determined his entire subsequent path, turning him into this quiet, ordered emptiness. He did not suffer. He served a sentence in a cell he had built himself. The catalyst arrived not with thunder, but with the rustle of pages. Among a batch of books from a ruined estate lay a tome unlike the others, nameless without a single letter on its bluish-black binding, smooth and cold as a river stone. Its pages were blank, but this was not the emptiness of a clean sheet. It was a deep, silent matter, absorbing light and sound, resembling the finest cured leather. Krasin automatically ran his finger over it. In his mind, as it happened hundreds of times a day, yesterday's conversation with a client resurfaced. An awkward phrase he had uttered. An empty sound that left an unpleasant aftertaste. He blinked, and lines appeared on the page beneath his finger. Not ink. Rather, a frosty pattern on glass. The text described yesterday's dialogue, word for word. And there it was, that very phrase that had made him feel ashamed. With a trembling hand, he took a stylus, an embossing tool, and barely touched a single word in the line. He didn't cross it out. He merely traced the characters, as if smoothing a wrinkle. The pattern on the page wavered and rearranged itself. The word disappeared. And at that very instant, a mechanism in Krasin's memory clicked into place. The recollection had changed. Now it was smooth, correct, without a single flaw. He remembered yesterday's conversation exactly that way, flawless. Cold sweat soaked his shirt. He looked at the black tome, and his craft, for the first time, seemed to him not a salvation, but a pathetic parody of true power. All his life he had stitched together dead pages, when he could have rewritten the living fabric of existence. He held not a book in his hands. He held a scalpel with which he could open the flesh of the past and excise the single tumor that had poisoned all his days. But a surgeon doesn't start with the heart. Before opening the chest cavity, he hones the blade on dead tissue, studies the tremor of his own hand, grows accustomed to the weight of the steel. Krasin placed the black tome on his workbench, under the lamp's light, and did not touch it for several days. He circled it like a wild beast, accustoming himself to its silent presence. He lived his ordinary life, but now it had become a testing ground for him. Every awkwardness, every hesitation, every sidelong glance cast at him on the street. He no longer endured these, but collected them. He carried these small splinters into his workshop like kindling for a fire. In the evenings, he would sit at his desk. This was his new ritual, displacing the old one. He no longer restored others' books. He edited his own. At first, it was almost a game, a calligraphy exercise. He would recall an awkward conversation with the baker, and the text would appear on the page. He didn't change the essence, no. He merely adjusted the intonations. He replaced his embarrassed mumbling with a firm, calm answer. He wiped the dust of uncertainty from his image. The memory in his head warmed, acquiring a noble sheen. This wasn't a lie, he convinced himself, but merely bringing the form into alignment with the intent. After all, he had wanted to respond exactly that way. He was simply correcting a regrettable imperfection in execution. Gradually, his edits became bolder. He began to erase entire days. A week ago, he had caught a cold, spending 3 days in chills and weakness, a pointless, humiliating state. He recalled this gray stain of time, and when lines about fever and aching bones appeared on the page, he swept over them with the stylus like a street sweeper with a broom. A click sounded in his mind. He remembered having 3 free days last week. He had spent them reading, in quiet and peace. The memory of the illness vanished, like saliva on a hot stone. Along with it, the fear of the body's infirmity also disappeared. His inner world began to change. Thoughts, once swirling in a complex, tangled dance of regrets and self-analysis, straightened out, becoming simpler. Why analyze an error if it could be undone? Why reflect on weakness if it could be excised? A psyche freed from the need to process negative experiences became smooth as a river stone. He felt an unprecedented lightness. He was shedding ballast. He was cleansing himself. With each erased word, with each corrected scene, he resembled a human less and less, and more a flawless mechanism whose gears turned without friction or squeaking. And then, one evening, he felt ready. His hand did not tremble. The tool was calibrated. His inner house had been purged of small debris, and now, in its echoing emptiness, only one main rotten beam remained, supporting the entire cursed structure. He closed his eyes, and before him appeared that dimly lit corridor, 20 years condensed into a single moment. The scalpel was poised. On the black page, a tangle of events appeared, dull as an old scar. There it was, the corridor. There were two shadows, his and hers, Anna's, and a third, the shadow of the accuser, whose voice was like stone scraping glass. Words of accusation, false and heavy, fell into the silence, and he remained silent. Anna looked at him, and in her gaze was not a plea but a certainty that he would now tear this web apart with the sound of his voice. But no sound was born. His throat was choked with the dry clay of fear. He looked away. This gesture, a tiny movement of his eyeballs, broke her life. He raised the stylus. His first impulse was a thirst for a heroic deed, to correct, to inscribe his cry, his righteous anger into the past, to make himself a hero, a savior. He could already see new words forming on the page, his voice like a hammer, shattering the lies. The memory would become glorious, heroic. He would remember himself as strong, but his hand froze. He suddenly understood with cold, serpentine clarity. Even if he inscribed a heroic deed into the past, he would still know that it was corrected cowardice. The worm of knowledge would remain. The memory of who he truly was would sit within him like a tumor in a healthy body. One couldn't simply paint over the rot. It had to be cut out along with the flesh on which it had grown. And so, he began to edit not himself. He began to edit her. He guided the stylus not over letters, but along the veins of events. A light touch, and the confidence in her gaze was replaced by flickering anxiety. Another movement, and in her voice, which he remembered as clear, appeared whining, guilty notes. He didn't insert lies. He merely thickened the shadows. He took her awkward pause and transformed it into a liar's stumble. He took her fright and made it proof of guilt. He worked not as a restorer but as an executioner who doesn't kill, but slowly mutilates an image until it becomes indistinguishable from a monster. And then he reached the core. Her main answer. He didn't erase it. He merely traced the very heart of the phrase with the stylus's tip, and it cracked like ice, letting in ambiguity, a poison that tainted everything said before and after. He made her guilty, and his own silence, from a shameful brand of coward, transformed into the wise insight of a man who recognized the deception in time and chose not to soil himself. The foundation of his world shifted with a dull, bony scrape. He blinked. A clear, cold picture stood in his mind. The corridor, the accusation, and her lying, evasive face. He remembered looking at her with quiet contempt, how his silence was a wall against which her cunning shattered. He felt no relief. He felt order. The rot was excised. The house was clean now. 2 days later, driven not by curiosity but by a need for a final inspection, he found her. Old archives, a few phone calls. The world obediently yielded traces of the new, corrected reality. She lived on the outskirts, in a grey house resembling a forgotten beehive. He waited in his car. When she emerged, he didn't immediately recognize her. This was not the same woman. The one in his old memory, even after everything that had happened, had managed to maintain her posture, a certain inner rectitude that shone within her despite everything. This woman was stooped with dull, perpetually apologetic eyes. Her face was parchment on which another's will had etched a verdict. She carried a grocery bag, and an apple rolled out and fell into the mud. She looked at it, sighed, and trudged on, leaving it there. She didn't even fight for a small thing. Krasin started the engine. There was no pang of conscience in his soul, no shadow of doubt. He looked at the wreckage of another's fate, at this crushed life, not as the work of his hands, but as confirmation. confirmation that the world had finally taken its correct form. He felt the quiet, deep satisfaction of a carpenter who had long wrestled with a crooked doorframe and finally straightened it. Now everything was in its proper place. The door closed tightly, without gaps. And there were no more drafts. The order that reigned in his soul proved heavier than chaos. The silence that followed the expulsion of the soul ghost was not healing, but dead, like the silence in air evacuated from under a bell jar. He returned to his workshop, to his tools and glue, believing that now, with the main work of his life completed, he could return to his craft with a light heart. But he couldn't. He picked up an old book, saw a crack on the spine, a wrinkle on the parchment, and felt not professional zeal, but a dull, irrational irritation. Why bother with these worthless scraps when the very fabric of life was full of the same flaws? His consciousness, honed to the sharpness of a stylus, now worked without his will. He sat by the window, and a sunbeam, piercing through the dusty glass, lay on the floor in an uneven patch. He blinked. A click sounded in his mind. The memory of the beam became ideal, a smooth, clean rectangle of light. He drank tea and the taste seemed a little more bitter than it should be. Click. The memory of the taste became flawless. The sound of footsteps outside the door, a random thought, a fleeting sensation of a draft. Everything that touched his senses immediately passed through an internal crucible, where it was refined into a sterile, correct imprint. This bony click, once a sign of great power, now became the beating of his second mechanical heart, measuring not time, but a sequence of corrections. He stopped leaving the house. The world beyond the workshop walls was an unbearable carnival of imperfection. Every face, every phrase, every gesture demanded immediate correction, turning his existence into endless, exhausting editing. He tried to resist. He tried to hold on to the real, the living, the imperfect. A crack in a cup, a cobweb in a corner. But his own mind, like an overly zealous servant, immediately erased the blemish, presenting him with a verified, dead copy. He built walls around himself from a flawless past, and they were smooth as ice and just as impenetrable. He could no longer touch reality, he could only eternally polish its reflection in his mind. The black tome lay on the table, closed. It was no longer needed. The book had merely been a conduit that brought the disease to the surface. Now it lived within him. He became a living instrument for editing existence, a scalpel that could no longer help but cut. He got what he desired. A world without flaws, without regrets, without a single splinter. But it was a world cast in wax, devoid of air, warmth, and life. A world where nothing could happen, because every event died at the moment of its birth, replaced by an ideal duplicate. He sat in his quiet workshop, an eternal restorer, condemned to edit a book with no final page. And in the motionless mirror of every corrected moment, he saw only one thing: his own face. The face of a master, bent over the world as over a decayed foliant, not noticing that what lay beneath his hands was no longer parchment, but his own dust. The student asked, and if he doesn't see his mistake, if he burns it from memory, turning shame into valor, what then will he see in the still surface of the swamp? The teacher was silent for a long time, then replied, then he will see nothing. For he who has no past cannot be reflected in the water. He will become merely the wind, forever rippling others' reflections.